Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of Critical Wade Theory. And today I'm going to be talking about what is the difference between a music arranger and a composer? Is there a difference? Well, you might be also wondering what kind of credentials does this Wade character have? Well, I am a very unknown musician, so that doesn't really qualify, but I have interviewed the composer Carlos Rafael Rivera two times, and he's won three Emmys and a Grammy. He's scored The Queen's Gambit, Griselda, Department Q, and other such things. And I've also interviewed Joseph Loduca, who composed the scores for The Evil Dead 2, Army of Darkness, Ash vs. Evil Dead, and some Chucky franchise stuff as well. So I do have experience with talking to people in the music industry who have made some stuff for movies and TV shows, and I've interviewed other people as well. So that's a little bit of a background in what sort of credentials I have. And, welcome to this question. It's an interesting one. So, it's something that comes up all the time in music. What's the difference between this? What's the difference between that? And a composer and an arranger are technically different things, but they can be very similar. So, a composer is the person who creates the original piece of music. They're responsible for the melody, the harmony, the rhythm, the overall structure, basically the whole musical idea for the most part. It's debatable to what extent a person can truly create something original. There's always that debate. But we're just going to accept as a form of shorthand that composers can take some credit, right? We're going to for practical sake, for practical reasons, we're going to put aside that sort of debate to a large degree. Anyway, the composer writes the song or the score in its raw form. So think of it like writing the story. They're putting the words, the characters, and the plot down on paper, so to speak. And the arranger, they step in and ask, okay, how do we want the story to be told? Do we want it slow and dreamy, fast and punchy? Do we want a brass section blasting out the chords, or a string quartet weaving them gently? The arranger decides how the piece will be presented. So, like I noted in my episode on John Barry, the person largely credited with the scores to a lot of James Bond movies, he actually did not compose the James Bond theme, at least not exactly, but he arranged it in the most famous sort of way. So he took something that somebody originally had composed and he arranged it for the film in a way that more people recognize. So, the arranger might adapt it for a certain ensemble, change the style at least a little bit, reharmonize chords, add counter melodies, or tweak it to match a specific mood. It's like taking the same script but deciding who delivers which lines, how the pacing feels, and what the scenery looks like. And of course, there can be some overlap. That's where it gets a little bit interesting. In practice, the line isn't always so clear. One person can be both composer and arranger. In fact, many composers arrange their own works, and many arrangers are so creative that their versions feel almost like brand new compositions. In fact, if you've listened to a lot of cover songs, you've probably heard some cover versions that are almost unrecognizable, and you might be able to even say that they deserve a composition credit for making some major changes in how the song feels and that sort of thing. Of course, you can get into some legal territory with that sort of thing as well. To what extent does an original work become altered so that it's no longer just belonging to that musician or the original composer? And there's some murky waters there. And if you're in a courtroom, that might depend on what kind of lawyer you can afford. If you've got enough money and you can afford a quality lawyer, well, you might be able to better win the case. And you get into all sorts of interesting debates about compositions, like what style of music this is, and like, well, look at the genre of grunge music, for example. Some people will say a band couldn't be grunge if they're not from Seattle. That there's that whole school, and it's similar in concept to saying that a certain composition couldn't belong to this composer because it's done so differently that it's really no longer the original track. And the rap world has a lot of sampling, so you get into that sort of thing as well. Like, if you recontextualize something to a large degree, um, does it really have the same roots anymore? Are you just severing the original ownership claim? And of course, a lot of people would side with the original composer, but it's also the fact that sampling is also a little bit like a collage. Do you sue every collage artist, who does that sort of work? So that there's a little bit of a, well, not a little bit of a debate, but a lot of a debate. And the same thing is true of a lot of arrangements of different songs that might not include sampling. So you also get some of the basic aspects of this, like Beethoven is a great example of a pure composer, while Duke Ellington is famous for his genius as an arranger, reshaping and reimagining music so it becomes something entirely his own to a large degree. And there's creativity and risk involved. It's something that ties into something bigger with creativity itself. There's a quote from Robert Greene that I'd stumbled upon. He says there are two kinds of failure. The first is from never trying, from waiting for the perfect moment. You can't learn from that. The second is the failure that comes from being bold, putting your ideas out there and risking mistakes. That kind of failure actually sharpens your spirit and shows you how things must be done. Now I'm paraphrasing that quote, I think, but you get the idea. Like, but both composers and arrangers live in that space. They take risks, they borrow ideas, they reshape them, and sometimes the experiment fails, but that's how the best music gets written. And it's all a process of coming up with the best thing that you can with whatever material you have at hand. So that's whether you are a composer or you're just arranging something. So, to sum it up, the composer writes the story, the arranger decides how that story is told, and in the end, both roles are about a little bit about bravery. You're being creative, you're putting your stuff out there, and you got to be willing to turn an idea into sound, and that's that always requires, not to say requires that much courage, but whenever you put your material out there, you've got to face an audience, and that audience can be brutal and critical. It's a potentially depressing thing if you're a creative person and somebody's just brutalizing your work. So you're gonna have sort of nerves of steel if you're gonna be entering this line of work at times. It's something that requires a little bit more backbone than some people might give it credit for. And thankfully, when I've made music and put it on YouTube or something, I don't only get negative feedback. I actually do get some people who seem to appreciate it, and that sometimes is even true for things that I'm not that crazy about, that I've uploaded or whatever, submitted on an album through DistroKid or something like that. It's sometimes surprising what will be popular and what will not be popular, and it can be a difficult thing to predict. That's why That's why if you're in the music industry as a composer or an arranger, you're kind of taking a gamble. You're trying to think of what you think will work, and sometimes what you expect to do well isn't what is the best. Some people might prefer the thing that you thought is just crap. That's what's so funny about it. But anyway, I think I've said enough about this topic. I'm sure you've got opinions on what I'm talking about. Some of you might agree with what I've said, some of you might take issue with something. So feel free to let me know about that. And thanks for listening. And remember, don't wait for the perfect time. Write, arrange. Don't be afraid of failure, and keep creating, even if it seems like you're not going to have success. And don't be afraid to learn from those mistakes too. And do what seems comfortable, and also to some degree, yes, listen to your audience. If you talk to some people out there, they're going to tell you, no, just do what you want, keep it pure, don't listen to the audience. But I would say that to some small degree, you have to try to be conventional occasionally. That's if you want to have an audience. You've got to have a little bit of give and take. You've got to be able to give people a little bit of what they want while still trying to retain some truth in whatever you're trying to convey. And that's a little bit of a battle. And some people would not admit that they're sort of reshaping their sounds to cater a little bit to an audience. But when it comes down to it, there's a little bit of that going on with practically every genre and every musician. It's just a part of the creative process when you're dealing with an audience, at least for the most part. It's it's also true that sometimes you can just put out a bunch of crazy stuff and some people will like that. But if you're trying to grow and have a diverse array of musical styles, and you're trying to not just be one note, then it kind of pays to have an audience that gives you feedback, lets you know what they like, lets you know what they don't like, and try not to take that too personally. Anyway, that's about it for now, and I guess have a good day.